organizational storytelling. Who doesn't like a good story, right? And importantly, who doesn't remember a good story? This is one of our more popular webinars. In fact, popular to the point where we added another session next Tuesday. So if you enjoyed today's session and would like to invite any of your coworkers to next Tuesday's session, there's plenty of seats available for that session. Let me do some housekeeping and introduce our presenter today. First, from a housekeeping standpoint, submit your questions. We'll be monitoring the questions throughout the webinar, and we will hopefully be leaving 5-10 minutes at the end to answer the questions that come up. Second, don't feel you need to jot down tons and tons of notes of what you see on the screen. We will be sending out copies of the slides at the conclusion of the webinar, and also a recording of this webinar will be available. So you'll get the slides, and if you want, you'll be able to listen to it again if you'd like to get a copy of the recording. Let me take a minute to introduce our presenter today, Scott Brooks. Scott is one of the original founding partners, along with myself and Natan Lerner of Org Vitality. Scott, by the way, he's got a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, and recently Scott was named a fellow in the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, a very well-deserved honor. I've known Scott for a very, very long time. I won't admit to how long, but Scott and I have known each other for a very, very long time at this point. We've written books together, we've written articles together, and in fact, we have a chapter in a book coming out next month on employee life cycle surveys. But one of the interesting things because Scott talks about a topic is no matter how many times I hear him present on a particular topic, each time there's some new nugget, some new interesting bit of information that seems to come out. So I don't care if I've heard Scott talk on a topic 5-10 times. It's enjoyable each and every time because I find it interesting and stimulating. So I hope you enjoy today's session as much as I'm sure I'm going to. And again, don't forget to submit your questions, and we will leave some time at the end to answer those. So Scott, if you're ready, I'll let you begin.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Well, storytelling is a great topic, and it's a fascinating topic. And one of the things that this particular webinar is based on is a book that Jeff mentioned that he and I both wrote. This is actually chapter 12 in this book that came out a few years back. And the theme of the book is balancing the execution of day-to-day with the exploration of the new. But less about that and more about storytelling. Let's get into the topic. So whether we've thought about it explicitly or not, we all intuitively know that stories connect us, helps us share ideas and goals and values. Stories captivate and educate and inspire. And within an organization, which is the focus of this webinar, stories bind people together. They humanize top leaders and motivate employees. And one of my favorite definitions of organizational culture, by the way, is it's the stories that people tell when you're not in the room. So we'll be touching on that quite a bit as we go. Over the past decade, storytelling has been increasingly and formally recognized as an important part of organizational life, and it's inspired a lot of leadership research, and we'll touch on some of that. It's inspired full consulting businesses, and even the job title of chief storyteller. Now, it's always been important, but I'm going to start with a story here. So back in 1950s, there was a doctor in Minnesota, Dr. Lillihei, who was performing surgery on children with blue baby syndrome. And the surgery often left children needing to be temporarily attached to a pacemaker. And pacemakers at the time were large devices that required their own carts and relied on wall current for power. Now, in October 31st, Halloween in 1957, there was a great big snowstorm in Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And sadly, one of Dr. Lily High's young patients had died. Dr. Lily High, who had worked with a man named Earl Black before, asked him the next day if he could solve the problem. 4 weeks after finding a circuit diagram for a metronome in Popular Mechanics, Earl Black delivered a battery-powered transistorized pacemaker about the size of a few deck of cards. And after successfully testing this in the laboratory, Bakken returned to create a refined model for some patients, but he came back to the hospital and found out that the next day that Dr. Lily High had actually implanted this pacemaker already in use on a patient. Now, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States didn't start regulating medical devices until almost 20 years later, or about 20 years later in 1976. Now, Earl had a small medical equipment repair shop, and it's since grown into a $5 billion corporation with 100,000 employees, and it's known as Medtronic today. So what is this story? This is an origin story inside of a major corporation. It has the values of the founder in terms of compassion for the children and working to find a cure and a cause and a solution. It's got innovation. It's got also a touch of the founder's personality involved in it. So all of this, I think, is really relevant, and we'll be talking a little bit more about origin stories later. But let me step back from this particular story, and we'll return to it a little bit. But when we are thinking about stories, there is a truism that we think in generalities, but we live in detail. We want to understand concepts. We want to understand strategies and approaches and so forth. But the detail we live in is the detail of stories. We think and talk, we communicate to others, maybe in generalities with some data perhaps, but we live in the detail. We want the storyline. We want the narrative of our lives. We want to be connected with people, not just spreadsheets or big data analyses. So enter stories. And let's think about what are some of the biggest stories in our culture today. And let's step away from corporations and organizations and think cinema and box office. And if you think about that, one of the biggest trends over the past decade or so has been the Marvel movies about superheroes, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Thor, and the like. And we know it's touching a nerve because just box office, not even counting merchandising and everything else, we're about $30 billion in worldwide box office take. So what are some of the best features of a great superhero story? Well, there's really two parts. And believe it or not, there are college professors who research this kind of thing and really go for it. But the two best parts of a origin story really have two interwoven components. The first is what makes them super, right? Now, this is how they got their powers, what makes them strong, how do they fight, and so forth. And the second part is what makes them heroes. How do they do good in the world? What drives them to do what they do? Why are they a superhero instead of a supervillain, right? Now, if we take Spider-Man, for example, those of you who know the story, Peter Parker is a high school kid who develops his abilities after being bitten by a radioactive spider. And that's how he got his powers. But why is he a hero is fueled by his guilt over his Uncle Ben's murder that he could have prevented, and from the moral and the human center provided by his Aunt May. So these are two different parts of Spider-Man, and sometimes those two things conflict. And that helps to make for a great character and really a great story. Now, it's maybe the concept of a superhuman being with spider-like powers that draws you in, but it's his personal mission and character arc that keeps you interested, right? So that's superheroes, and that's fine, but let's bring it back to organizations where we all sit. What are some of the best parts of organization origin stories, like the one I just told from Medtronic? First one is, well, what makes them super? How do they succeed? What makes them good at what they do? What makes them beat the competition? How do they earn money? But we can also ask a question like, what makes them heroes? And by this, I don't mean the sense of let's all run around as individuals and save the day, but collectively as organizations, why do they do what they do? What's their mission? Why do they choose to do option X over all the other option Ys that are possibly out there? What force compels them to make a difference in the world? And you could think about Earl Black, where what makes him super? Well, you know, he's clever. He owned a small medical repair device company, and he was pretty fluent in the magazine Popular Mechanics and was clever at adapting things. But what made him a hero was coming in and making something that was needed in the moment. And the whole context of helping to save children was pretty dramatic. So these two sides of an origin story are kind of like, how do you pursue current performance? How do you make money? How do you get things done? And also, how do you pursue future potential, which is the hero part, which is how do you develop new capabilities for tomorrow? When do you invest in things? When do you maybe grate against earning money and do things that actually cost you money? It's kind of like how you fight the battle today, but also what makes you come back tomorrow. So this is an example of using stories that helps articulate what works in your organization. So, you know, think about this, you know, as you are considering your own organizations, what are these two pieces to the stories that you tell? When you tell stories about being successful, about earning money, about making things happen, versus when you tell stories about choices and why you choose option A over option B. So let's transition for a moment from just talking about stories to understanding how to tell better stories. At Org Vitality, we tell stories from data all the time. And one frequent way we cast them is exactly this. How do you execute today? And also, how do you guide yourself into the future for tomorrow? So how do we talk about stories? What is the discipline of storytelling? We're going to spend a little time unweaving this. Now, many people might say that they would tell stories if they only knew some good ones. That is not the right place to start. I'm not buying it. There's a very concise quote: stories happen to those who can tell them. This has been attributed to many people, but maybe most commonly to Ira Glass, who is host of the national public radio show in the United States called This American Life. And what's the point of this? Think about the people you know around you, the people that tell stories. It's often the same people who are always telling the stories, right? It's less likely that they magically have more interesting things happening to them. And it's more likely that they notice and can recount things in a compelling way. So that's the first step. Let's together here in the rest of the webinar, learn how to tell stories better. And I think part of the subtext of this is that if we learn to tell stories, the content will come, right? So what are some of the basic areas of content of stories? Stories that are often told in business, we've got origin stories. I talked a little bit about this one. We've got the nature of our challenge story. Why is it that what we're doing is unique or important? We have the striving to improve story, right? How do we get better at the kinds of things we do? The coming together, bonding as people despite our differences. Performance tales. These are tales of triumph, like how the value of Post-it notes at 3M were met with skepticism until some of the clever inventors got 3M's own administrative assistants hooked and then cut off supply. We've got how the organization took care of employees, not just the stated, but the demonstrated values of an organization when an organization went the extra mile to help somebody out. And then we've got the where are we going stories, not just predicting the future, but in fact, defining it. Now, just a couple of examples. We love our origin stories. I mentioned Medtronic. Les Wexner was the founder of Limited Brands. He borrowed $12,000 from his aunt on the sly in order to open a business and prove a point to his dad about how certain types of clothing were more profitable than others, and that an apparel store limited to the lower price point basics like socks and underwear would make more money, right? And you know, there's triumph stories and stories that reflect our value. We also, honestly, we love the train wreck stories, those that tell of disaster and intrigue and thievery and general nastiness. I'm not really going to spend as much time on those, as they generally don't move the organization forward. But there is a point to be made later about stories of failure told in the right way that can be hugely valuable. Now, all of these things move us because they humanize our leaders. They suggest that they're either fallible or great or both, or serve as dramatic examples of leaders' ethics that determine whether or not those leaders are deserving of our respect or not. So, you know, the first piece of advice, or amongst many here, is, you know, pick a topic and listen for stories, and you will get better. Now, we can also ask the question, well, what makes for a good story? I want to move now towards what makes a story effective, what makes it succeed. So the kind of stories I'm going to talk about first are those where you want to picture an executive on stage, let's say, you know, giving a town hall address or talking about strategy or something like that. So think about that kind of a story right now as I move forward. Right? So hopefully you have something like that in mind. Now, there are some truths to effective organizational stories, and these were identified by a veteran filmmaker, Peter Gruber, who distills the lessons of his industry in Hollywood into 4 truths of the storytelling for business leaders. So what are they? First is truth to the teller. So a storyteller's tongue, feet, and wallet must move in the same direction, and that's a great way to phrase it, right? So it's more than just walking the talk. It's you also spend in the same way. And what does this mean? You know, it's what I say, what I do, and how I spend my precious resources should all be consistent. And this is a mark that the storyline is consistent with the storyteller's value and style, right? Some of the most potent stories we tell and retell are in fact about decisions that cost us money, but pursue some value that is more important, like employee safety or integrity with customers. So you can ask yourself the questions like, when would I sacrifice profits for a larger goal? That makes for a huge storytelling opportunity. Employees will often never know top leadership directly, but they will know them through stories. You know, one quick illustration, small one, is several years ago, I was in a presentation with executives of a healthcare delivery organization in the Southeast United States. And the president expressed some dismay at a low employee survey score regarding how much management used good ideas that employees had. And she said, they just don't know how much they keep me awake at night. Now, that simple statement drifted out of the conference room and into more general awareness, and it helped humanize the president that credibly reflected this truth to the teller. Second truth here is truth to the audience. Compelling stories start with what an audience values and cares about, not just the top leaders. Gruber, in an HBR article, tells of Sally Krawcheck, who held CEO positions at Smith Barney and a Citigroup unit. And she was a person known who could draw an audience in by citing a common bond of awkward preteen years. She would say, there was nothing they could do to me at Solomon Brothers in the 80s that was worse than the 7th grade. You hear that and immediately you're drawn in and you're listening to the person, not just the facts and figures. And we can contrast that with another president of a professional services firm that I knew pretty well, who tried to connect with his audience by talking about the cash that the organization had accumulated and had available to devote to various business development efforts. Now, talking about cash and resources like that is fine, but what the audience actually heard in this case was the disconnect between the rich organization and the low wages that they were paid. The leader was starting with what was important to him and not the audience. He separated himself from the audience. Now, leaders commonly tell their stories of confidence in the future based on their own sense of market forces and spreadsheet-based metrics and intimate decision-making sessions But the most compelling stories of the future must start with what the audience values and cares about, not what the top leaders care about. You can think about it, how often have you seen in your own workplace that executives are just in a different place than employees at large? That's all the time. And in fact, in a lot of our work that we do with employee surveys and other metrics, we're able to split apart the opinions of top leaders from everyone else and evaluate how disconnected or how connected the top leaders are. The next truth here is truth to the moment. And we're not talking about a verbatim script or a regurgitated reflex, but something that's powered by passion in that moment. So you always love a speech when a top leader stands up, tosses aside his or her notes and says, I'm gonna go off script. That draws you in and you feel like something special is coming, something that's unique to that moment and something that you're a part of. And that is something very exciting for the audience. For stories to be gripping and compelling, they need to feel genuine at the time. And this is not the same as always telling something new and never saying the same thing twice. Clearly, many stories will be told and retold and will not always be completely spontaneous. But even if you've heard it before, when a really great storyteller recounts a tale, you have the sense that it's not verbatim or regurgitated, but it is in fact powered by the passion of the moment. And so paradoxically, while storytelling should seem to come from the heart and not from rehearsal, it does still take discipline and preparation. I'm sure that probably most of us on the phone here have seen various TED Talks, which begin almost formulaically with a personal story about what brought the speaker to this point. And then they'll launch into a potentially very sophisticated or technical topic. There's a formula that underlies that, and it works. And even though they're very rehearsed, they feel true to the moment, which speaks to the popularity of all these TED Talks. And listening to TED Talks, by the way, whether they're relevant to your field or not, can really help you understand techniques of good storytelling. And in fact, go and search for TED Talks about storytelling, and you'll learn something. The last truth is truth to the mission, which is that the story has to echo something that's larger than just the one story or the one storyteller. And this happens when it's clear that the leader is devoted to a cause larger than him or herself. Now, origin stories told by founders are so compelling because launching of a business or product or service is usually synonymous with the entrepreneurial passion to create something amazing that didn't exist before. And so that creation is often a story of an underdog beating the odds, or some sort of ingenious and very clever duct tape and paperclip kind of solution that actually worked. And there's no financial performance yet. It's all about being scrappy and figuring out how to make things happen. So clearly not all missions are success stories and not all tellers are part of an origin story. But if you think about the devotion to something larger, that's compelling in the telling. So I've asked you to think about stories that leaders tell, but not all stories are told on stage by top executives. Not all stories are grand and sweeping narratives in this way. Many years back, I had the good fortune to meet a fellow named Masa Tanaka, who at the time was president and CEO of Union Bank. And he kept a giant rubber ear in his desk. Now, he was a Japanese expat running a US company, and he knew he needed to stay really calibrated to the voice of the employees. So often when an employee or another leader would come in to speak with him, he'd pull out the rubber ear and hold it over his own ear while maintaining a very serious demeanor and cock his head and open his eyes maybe a little bit wider as if he were listening intently. And he used his big rubber ear to make the point that he understood that he needed to listen. And importantly, he wasn't just listening, to others. He was reminding all the other executives that they needed to listen too. And in the process, he created this lasting image in the minds of everyone around him that prompted them to tell stories. Have you seen Masa's ear? That's an opener. That talks about listening and promotes things beyond just his own direct storytelling. Now, stories always abound about CEOs regarding what they do, what they value, who they are. And people always try to make sense of the leaders above them. So here's a question. What do your employees want to say about you? What do they say about you, particularly when you're not in the room? So let's let that drip for a minute. What do people say when you're not in the room? But I want to have a little sidebar here on metaphors. In our own work, we deal with organizational data about people. And I want to give you sort of 3 quick examples of metaphors we often use in our work. First, changes like New Year's resolutions. Sometimes you know what you need to work on already, but measurement helps make it happen. You stand on the scale on New Year's Eve and then decide you need to lose a few pounds, but you already kind of knew that. But the New Year's resolutions, and in particular the science of New Year's resolutions, is remarkably similar to that of organizational change. Making commitments, goals, plans, coping strategies for the barriers you're going to encounter, the buddy system, and so forth. Look it up. And if you mentally replace the word New Year's resolution with organizational change, it's kind of hard to tell the difference of the advice being offered. And really the answer is, how do you keep your foot on the gas of maintaining your resolutions past March? And it's the same with organizational change. Second metaphor that I want to just breeze through is engagements like gas in the tank. An empty tank definitely prevents movement. And so no employee engagement means you're not really going to go anywhere, but a full tank of gas is no guarantee that the car is going to make it anywhere. What does engagement, employee engagement in your situation, your scene, what does it power for you? Unique bits about your organization isn't the gas, and gas is in fact the most generic thing across all kinds of cars. But it's the engine that gets you where you need to go, or maybe the tires, or whether it's an off-road truck or something built to move dirt or whatever it happens to be. It's the engine that is sometimes the more interesting part. So this just helps position employee engagement into a larger context. And then also going back to organizational change, HR is kind of like a personal trainer. It's not a personal trainer's job to do your sit-ups for you. And it's not HR's job to do your work for you, but rather to be a coach, a champion, a guide, and support you live up to your own good intentions. There's a lot more that can be said about all this stuff, but the bigger point is the value of metaphors. First, we remember them. Second, they help convey a richer message than a simple statement. They might connect ideas and thoughts and even emotions in your head and advance the way you think or feel about something. Maybe if you remember nothing else about this presentation, you might remember that employee engagement is really just the gas gauge of organizational effectiveness. And there can be a lot of other indicators important for the model of car that your organization is and where you're trying to get where you need to go. So I want to move from this to how we tell stories. And part of it is, how do you drive a message that gets told and retold? And so I'm going to borrow a couple of tips from literary techniques. You don't need them all, but hopefully thinking about this will open you up to some better storytelling in general. So the first one's going to be suspense. If you think for a second, I've got some really useful, cool, and maybe even a little bit funny points about suspense to come up with. But I gotta wait on that. So hold that thought. We'll come back. What I do want to talk about is first, melodrama. Melodrama is what? It's the idea that everything is urgent, critical, a must-win or burning platform. And in the end, it's a manufactured urgency from fear rather than compelling opportunity. Interestingly, there's research that suggests that fear motivates, yes, but it's better at motivating inaction or rigidity than it is at motivating action and creation. So, for example, fear of harming one's own child is what leads some, in the face of overwhelming medical evidence, to not vaccinate a baby. So fear inspires inaction. What's the opposite? Well, hope is what inspires action. It's more sustainable, and that's where we want to be. So what's the tip on this? How do you avoid melodrama? You want to ignite passions. You want to join people together by articulating compelling, audacious goals. Now, here's a couple of examples. In the Disney movie called Miracle, which recounts the true story of the United States' men's hockey team that won the gold medal in the 1981 Olympics. They defeated Russia in a defining moment. And in the movie, at a critical moment in the biggest game of the Olympics, Coach Herb Brooks said, "Tonight, we are the greatest hockey team in the world. You were born to be hockey players, every one of you. You were meant to be here tonight. This is your time." And so it's just a quick snippet, but it was one of those very inspiring coach talks that says, like, you were meant to be here. You were born for this. Let's make it happen. It pulls people together, helps them work as a team. It emphasizes what's at stake. It's truth to the moment. Now, a more organizational example, other than Miracle, is in Alcoa. Now, I'm going to take you back to October of 1987, and the new CEO of Alcoa, Paul O'Neill, gave his maiden speech to shareholders. He said, "If you want to understand how Alcoa is doing, you need to look at our workplace safety figures. If we bring our injury rates down, it won't be because of cheerleading or the nonsense you sometimes hear from other CEOs. It will be because the individuals at this company have agreed to become part of something important. They've devoted themselves to creating a habit of excellence. Safety will be an indicator that we're making progress and changing our habits across the entire institution. That's how we should be judged." That's pretty cool. He could talk about safety as a problem and a danger and a fear and a disaster, but instead he talks about coming together and how you're going to be judged. Like, I want to work for that guy, right? Now, both of these examples are certainly stirring, and they emphasize bringing people together to do important things that are greater than themselves. You can also go find President Kennedy's speech about the moonshot that talks more about opportunity than about Cold War fears. Let me move to another literary technique, character arc. What is this? It's our favorite stories show how protagonists change. Think about some of your favorite stories or books or movies or literature, and they're not going to be impactful unless they show how protagonists unless the protagonists change. Protagonists that don't change might be entertaining, but not moving. So just a couple of examples about the arc where you want goal, you can't get a goal, you try to get a goal, and you have now changed attitudes towards the goal. Think about Mulan. Disney often starts stories with an I wish song. And in fact, The Wizard of Oz does too, where it's a song that reflects what the main protagonist wants, you know, what's over the rainbow or who's the real me or whatever it happens to be. Now, in Mulan, there's a story about a young woman who, yeah, she saves China, but the main arc is about having her outer self reflect the inner self. I got to say, I am looking forward to seeing the upcoming live action Mulan movie that Disney's popping out, and I want to see if it sticks to this fundamental arc. Another one we all know, Luke Skywalker, and he famously reflects Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Joseph Campbell was a comparative mythologist, and Luke is transformed from an orphan boy into someone from outside the center of action looking in, and he wishes for excitement. Then he learns about powers he didn't know he had, and he reconciles with the legacy of his father. By the way, I could have just as easily been describing Harry Potter, but this typical hero's journey works. Pride and Prejudice is about overcoming just that in the main characters. Iron Man, that really kicked off the Marvel's cinematic universe. It's not just an action movie. We invest in Tony Stark's change. Groundhog Day plays with this, where the day itself doesn't change. It's Groundhog Day relived over and over again, but Bill Murray's character is really the only thing that changes. And then here's a classic where the main character has a major reflection and epiphany on his own life. Now, the most impactful organization stories also show some human transformation, where people might say, this is what I wish I'd known. This is what we thought was important, but now we know better. We want to learn and grow together. There is an irony in politics where changing one's opinion is often punished. Stability is valued over growth based on new data. But in an organization, what can really draw people in is how people changed, what they've learned. Now, I know you've been waiting, so let's go back to suspense. So suspense is, not annoying people with artificially inefficient communication. But if you build anticipation or excitement, it can help the message. So here's two stories, right? One is an executive said, we made $4 million on that deal. That could be one story just by itself. But if you also hear an executive, you know, sitting back in his leather chair and it creaks a little bit, and he's recounting a story about how he narrowly missed his flight home, that was stuck overnight in China. And instead of the beautiful, spacious hotel where he spent the previous few nights, that was booked, and he was lucky to get a room at a rundown inn owned by a local husband and wife who fed him a traditional Chinese meal. And the executive details the delicious food and how he overcame the language barrier enough to communicate with the husband and wife that they wanted to sell their inn. And then he tells a story about buying the inn and turning it into a first-rate hotel, and ends with the triumph. Yeah, we made $4 million, all because I missed that first flight. Now, that story would have a bigger impact than the first. The listener doesn't just hear about the $4 million, but hears a little bit about the backdrop and will retain it better. In fact, there's new research that describes how listening to a story with setting and arc, we as the audience are tracking with and not against the storyteller. Even brain scans become aligned with the storytellers so that by the time the punchline comes around, we're already there. You're more open to facts and figures by the time the story gets there. Now, even in a database presentation, just saying something like, you know, if I'm about to deliver a big technical presentation, if I were to say, this is an exciting story, I found some things that surprised me that I've never quite seen before, and I'm here to tell you about them. And in fact, you'll see a couple of threads that will come together by the end. That kind of opener would set up a little bit of anticipation. It's not quite the creaky leather chair kind of details and so forth, but it is some anticipation nonetheless, and it's easy to do. Now, I've been focusing mostly so far on people telling their own stories, right? And in fact, you will want to tell your own stories, but the real impact is in the stories that others tell when you're not in the room. If you're a leader or an organizational consultant or trying to make organizational change, that's the real impact. What will people talk about when you're gone? So let me leave you with a couple of points about helping other people tell stories. First, people who tell stories are more committed to the organization. There is research that talks about this. And in fact, it suggests that stories that tend to be told are more pro than anti-organization. That means we can jump in and encourage storytelling, right? And so how do you help those people tell their own stories? The stories that may lurk there, and until you ask, you might not know. And so with this, you develop a storytelling discipline within your own organization. And part of that is encouraging and listening and repeating the stories that your employees have to tell. You don't just tell your own stories, tell other people's stories. And like with any skill that you develop, practice. Encourage practice, practice in yourself, illustrate it, and so forth. Another part of helping stories get told by others is to create events that spawn their own stories. You may have heard of organizations that have things like a lame duck award that might reward some grand failures in innovation. You know, innovations that were well conceived, might have worked, but in the end were a waste of time and money. But the process was valuable, and you're celebrating that process. And who knows, maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 100, maybe that's all it takes for the process to work, and that could be plenty. Another one, this is one where I was actually in attendance many years back at a town hall meeting. Top executives were trying to highlight what is not going to happen anymore and what should happen towards the future, right? And so they would inscribe things on scraps of paper and throw them into a coffin, and then they wound up carting the coffin out into the parking lot afterwards and lighting it on fire. So that's kind of dramatic, but it helped make a point. Another, there's a healthcare organization that I worked with quite a bit who used to have a blitz day. A blitz day was a tactic that was adopted from unions in the United States. But what they did is they organized a set of people in one afternoon, and then the next morning, these people that were leaders and folks from HR and union reps and so forth, they went across the entire organization at all locations that next day, and they greeted everybody who came into work, and they handed them a piece of candy and a card and said, think of an idea that would improve patient care or customer service and go tell your boss. And then they moved on. They didn't collect the ideas then. What they were doing is just going around, and they wound up creating a very real buzz. And even years later, people would say, hey, remember that day when everybody came around? And in fact, they liked this organization liked the idea so much that a few years later, they repeated it with patient safety as the topic of choice, right? Or if you really want to go completely audacious, back in 1978, a couple of EDS executives were taken hostage by the Iranian government, and Ross Perot, the head of EDS at the time, tasked a retired colonel named Bull Simmons. The fact that this guy's name was Bull just makes the story way better. And Bull assembled a team of Vietnam veterans from EDS's own workforce to go rescue his own people. That's a story that tells itself. How cool is that? Now, not everybody's going to have the opportunity to do this, but what does that say about, your feet and your tongue and your wallet all move in the same direction? Ross Perot funded all of this, and that was pretty awesome. So the question is, through all of these, how do you create an environment where stories tell themselves? You probably can't charter and fund a paramilitary incursion into another country, but you can strive for something audacious, something that speaks to a deep truth. So as we start to wind down, there's a couple of important points I want to convey. First, Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, it was one of his moral centers, and he said, with great power comes great responsibility. And so he didn't know it at the time, but he was really setting a tone for the heroic part of Spider-Man, the actual superhero. So he's got all this great power, and he's supposed to use it. And in this is a paradox of stories, right? Sometimes fiction is called the lie that tells the truth. It's a lie because it's fiction, right? But it speaks to a larger truth. It tells us about what it is to be human. It moves us, and we remember it. And if you think about Mark Twain or Shakespeare, or maybe even that book you picked up in the airport, the best fiction speaks about human truths. And if you match that up with the idea that authenticity is emotional, not factual, it's a demonstration of values, not facts and figures. Our brains are wired to make sense of the world in terms of narrative. But one of the things this sets up is that stories work with, not against, cognitive biases and heuristics, right? There are, in fact, cognitive biases that lead us astray. Stories are easier to remember than facts and figures, and easier to retell, which invokes, if any of you know, the availability heuristic, which is the inclination to rate as more probable cases that come more easily to mind. I'm not going to take you to school that much, but there's also like a conjunction fallacy, which is the tendency to give more weight to detailed explanations than simple ones. And it's essentially the same thing as giving more weight to a story than to a simpler concept. Now, while it's absolutely important to wrap your data into stories and to try to figure out the story that gets remembered, it's important that our stories are in fact on target and you're not just making stuff up. Compelling narrative can transport us into the action, and rather than stepping back and critically evaluating the message, we step into it and we ride along. That's the strength, but it's also the challenge to use your powers for good. So how do you do that? Well, make sure the stories are correct, get the facts right, don't just wing it, make them grounded. And so here's a little bit of a primer for telling stories based in data, which is something that I know a number of us on the phone do quite a bit. First is know what you believe. Create conclusions as if you had to defend them to a panel of critical peers. In my own professional background, I am an industrial and organizational psychologist, and I imagine standing up in front of our big conference to a group of people who might criticize my conclusions and statistics and so forth. But first thing I do is I need to know what I believe and know it in a defensible way. But then you also have to step back and say, hey, what convinces you might not be what convinces your audience. And so you need to consider different kinds of evidence. People from different backgrounds and different disciplines may not accept the same technical foundations that drove your own conclusions. They might require different kind of evidence. Like sometimes people respond to just a plain quote, right? Instead of statistical figures with a lot of Greek coefficients. You know, and so single cases and so forth, but you want to consider what convinces them. And then you want to start with a relatable message and don't necessarily start at the logical beginning. There is a axiom in writing a novel when you just write your novel and then eventually you're going to just delete chapters 1 and 2. So you start with chapter 3. A lot of times people don't care where you started. They want to start with chapters 2 and 3 because that's where the action really is. There's also another adage in writing books that a 200-page book that used to be 400 pages is always going to be much better than a book that was always only 200 pages. Same is true with your slide decks that you make. A 10-slide slide deck that used to be 50 or 60 slides is always going to be better than a 10-page slide deck that was always just a 10-page slide deck, right? Draw upon evidence that might be beyond your current project. Your audience doesn't make decisions in a vacuum. Sometimes we have a dream that we will deliver the best presentation ever and stand up in front and people will say, that is the word, that is the truth. We're going to go do exactly what you said. But that's never going to happen. And so you need to sort of incorporate what's the context of what people are doing. But definitely drive your audience towards action. Action requires confidence that what you're saying is important. There is a truism that those who are most certain are those without data, which is kind of ironic and a little sad, but the people who dwell in data see shades of gray and they see exceptions because there always are. Bulletproof cause and effect relationships don't exist in pure science, but your goal is not just to convey a message of data, but to help people understand implication. And that's going to require a leap of faith beyond just what your data say. And so you ask the question, and there's two plausible answers here. Who is in the best place to draw out those conclusions? Is it you, the person presenting, or is it the person who is in the audience and you just want to lay it out and let them conclude? Sometimes you are the best person to draw those conclusions because you've dwelt and you understand it better. So don't be afraid of doing that. And then last, deliver an engaging narrative. Data alone will never inspire or drive action. Marketing a technically based product or idea is based on a different discipline, a different skill set than developing the product or idea in the first place. Facts and figures might make you seem smart. This is what research actually says. It might make you seem smart, but stories will make you compelling. So one way to kind of sum up one of these points is to say, what will people remember once you leave the room? And in any presentation you give, try thinking about that and maybe even calling it out loud. What are you going to know? What are you going to believe? What are you going to remember when you leave the room? Who knows? Maybe 1 out of 3 people will go back to the glorious and pretty deck that you developed at one point. But most of the time, people will walk away with something. And if you don't have something for them to retell easily a week later, it won't stick. Now, one of the things that we have for you is there is a website, ov-cvo.com, where you can go. And it's a companion website to the book that I mentioned earlier. And there's actually little Quizlets where, corresponding to each chapter. And the one on storytelling, I won't really walk through all of these, but this is a way to tell how good storytelling is happening within your organization. So let me bring this together as we conclude with a map or a summary of this talk. So certainly you have a message that you have, and you have your audience that you're trying to connect it with. And there is a winding path, excuse me, that you take to get there. And maybe it's guided by the 4 truths of storytelling. Maybe you have had to go around the general forest of detailed trees, pass by the metaphoric fork in the road, wandered through the retelling meandering creek, definitely skirted away from the burning bog of melodrama, and you went up and over the Rubicon of character arc in order to get there. So I don't want to oversimplify or make this too cartoony in the end, but hopefully this is a way where you can step back and remember the main points that were in this webinar. So with that, I think we're at a place where we can talk about your questions and anything else that might have been submitted. Jeff?
Well, I've got a few questions, but one that came in through the question and answer box is, Scott, can you share a startup story about org vitality, or another one that captures the essence of your firm? What's a startup story about org vitality, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of little stories in there, but I think to me, it's you, Jeff, whispering, when we were both working for the company we used to work for, saying we could do this better. And it was, in the end, kind of an opportunity to do the kind of work that we felt was important and valuable in a climate where lots of startups were being acquired by bigger companies and being acquired by bigger companies. And the bigger you get, the more you are run by, a CFO or sales kinds of goals and stock prices rather than by the work itself. And so your whispering of, we can do this better, to me, was all about that. It's like, let's be about the work.
Okay, thanks. And a second one just came in. Do you have any tips for incorporating storytelling into very data-heavy presentations? For example, how do you tell a story about engagement survey data?
I mean, it's a great question. I think we do it a lot. Some of it is like the car engagements, like gas in the tank, and you could roll with that, especially if you're in an organization where vehicles are powered by gas and you're trying to make stuff happen, where if engagements like the gas in the tank, that's part of your story that you're trying to talk about. And so, that's sort of one tip. What's the context of engagement? What do we engage people do? There's also, a lot of times there'll be open-ended comments where you can find things that reflect what you're saying, and you don't betray who said what, but you could say, this is a factory shop floor worker who's been around for 20 years, and this is the kind of thing that they said about the company that might help make a point about the data. And there was also the sort of, primer I briefly ran through about, how do you tell stories from data and how do you keep it grounded in what you want? But I think a big thing is like, what do you want people to do once you leave the room, and how do you connect it to what they already care about? That's a big topic to go into.
Yeah.
But
yep.
I'll leave it at that.
Do you think, if you think about stories in different industries, whether it's, say it's the pharmaceutical industry, or say it's manufacturing, or say it's construction, do you think, or do you feel, or do you see that the stories sort of vary by industry in terms of the kinds of stories that exist?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the issues that are important in each of those industries change a little bit. Service versus construction, is safety important, that kind of thing. But I think that each company, if stories are all about connecting people, you know, how do you connect to your customers is going to be a different kind of story in each place. But I think each industry too should have different stories that come out. You do have different metaphors to leverage that reflect what you're trying to do as an organization, right? I think back healthcare again. I was trying to talk about drivers of employee engagement at one point, and there's a little confusion in the room about, you know, cause and effect and this and that and the other thing. And so we just started talking about being healthy, and you could eat right and you can exercise. Those are two drivers of being healthy. They don't technically cause each other, right? Working on one doesn't change the other. They coexist. And the idea of, yeah, I can eat well and not exercise, or I can exercise and not eat well, you know, those are two things that people get. And in health, that became a great sort of storyline to talk about and tell. You know, in pharma, you've got drug discovery, and in retail, you might have shrinkage or theft. And, you know, you find the metaphors that work for you. High tech would be something different too.
Do you have any sense of what may have more impact if, you know, if you can tell a story like a short story versus a story that's a long story versus a story that maybe has chapters in it that evolve over time? Is one better or than the other, more impactful than the other, or doesn't really matter?
You know, I think I would say it might not matter, but in the end, you want stories that other people can retell, and you know, or talk about how you said this and that and the other thing. So having things be super long, you know, people have short attention spans these days. So, you know, think about what is it that helps it be retold. And then think about what of the nature of the story has those truths to it, you know, truth to the teller, truth to the moment, truth to the mission, truth to the audience.
Well, speaking of truths then, I think one final question, will be out of time. So speaking of truths then, what if the stories that an organization tells or people in the organization aren't real? What if they're sort of clearly fabrications? What kind of damage can that do to the organization?
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's a really compelling story can drive more opinion and behavior than a dry set of facts that happens to be right. And so it comes back to that sort of Uncle Ben rule, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. You know, in the end, an organization that positions itself in the wrong direction isn't going to succeed. But a story is like anything else. It's just a tool, and you can hit your thumb with your hammer, and the hammer's neutral. It can be used wrong. So I think a story is just the same way. It's a tool. Use it well, use it responsibly, and that's the same thing that can be said of data.
Right.
Anything.
Right. So having a good story doesn't necessarily indicate success.
No, no. You know, you could be compelling in a wrong direction.
Right.
Right.
And with that, I think we're out of time. I think we should wrap up. Scott, let me give you the last moment for any concluding comments or thoughts.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the seminar. If you know, think about it right now and try to write down one thing that you want to retell about it when you talk to other people, whether it's one of the metaphors or one of the truths. But just in the 30 seconds we got after you hang up, just think about, you know, what one thing you're going to tell somebody else, and practice your art of storytelling from there. Okay.
If you go down one slide, Scott. Just a couple things coming up for your calendar. Well, actually, next Tuesday, we're going to be doing this session again because of the high demand for it. But March 24th, we have a session on empowering HR to drive business success. We have some other webinars coming up this year that you might be interested in, and you'll be receiving some more information on those, including things about the employee life cycle, innovation, change, employee engagement, nudging, and diversity and inclusion. And we're also very pleased this year to be co-sponsoring Psychology Day at the United Nations, which is going to be about multilateralism. If you'd like to learn more about that or would like to attend at the United Nations as our guest, drop us a line. Thank you all very much for your time.
All righty. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.